Thanks everybody for joining us for the Be Better Club again. Today we're scheduled to talk about Xenobots, in particular baby Xenobots. And I labeled this one in my sort of pessimistic way, baby Xenobots and other potential horrors. But I don't mean to be pessimistic. There's some really exciting potential here too. So we suggested listening to the Ethically Speaking lecture that Michael Levin gave back in October of 2021 through the series that Dr. Kubler has organized, where Levin introduced Xenobots. So we can talk a little bit about what Xenobots are, and I know, Stephen, you were going to just tell me a story about your own experience, and then we'll talk about what's happened just the month after Levin gave his talk to our series. So Stephen, what were you said you had an experience with planaria, you said?
Yeah, back in 1964, when I was a senior in high school, I was taking advanced biology, and I had read an article in Scientific American. It was about, where's memory stored in the brain? And one of the researchers, I believe his name was James McDonald, had an idea that it's stored in some kind of satellite cells in the nervous system. I believe that was the title of the Scientific American article. And he suggested doing an experiment with planaria, flatworms, where you train the flatworms using a light and a mild shock, which causes the planaria to contract. And then you take the trained planaria, once they learn to contract, you stop using the voltage to shock them and see if they still remember and have memory of contracting when you flash the light. And then you cannibalize them and you feed them to other planaria to see if, in fact, memory is stored somehow in the chemical processes, the biological processes. And he claimed that that would work. Well, I went through the whole thing. I did actually successfully train my planaria, but the feeding part, I think the class ended, the whole program ended before I got a chance to do that. And I've read a good bit about it. You can find the information on the internet, but it was a controversy, although there were several $1 million grants based on this research. And anyway, I can tell you a little bit more about that. If you look up gray goo, well, no, that's not the one. That's another one. The Memory Transfer Episode, Feeding Planaria Worms to Cannibalistic Brothers by James V. McConnell. He argued that memories were encoded in the structure of molecules. So that was back in, again, 1960. And then my experiment was 1964. But the other thing I wanted to mention, and you probably heard of the gray goo. This is Eric Drexler's ideas that was presented in his book, Engine of Creation. The idea, if you ever did produce some type of self-replicating, it wasn't biological with him. He was talking about some other type of structures. But if in fact it could absorb energy from the environment and it got out of control, then of course it would just simply replicate so fast and use up all the energy, and we would have a whole system of just gray goo. It would crowd us out and all biologicals. So that goes all the way back into the 1980s. So that ought to be brought up too.
Yeah, the gray goo story. Yeah, that's so interesting because it had such a big impact on nanotechnologies, which was Drexler's focus at the time. And it was so interesting because this came from sort of a science fiction background, right? It wasn't grounded or evidenced by science in any way, but it was like this potential horror that could come out of this emerging technology. And I feel like this is one of the threads of this conversation. Every time we introduce a new technology, there's this, ooh, what can it do? And also this, oh, what could it do? And the benefits and the horror story, and we sort of hypothesize all the various outcomes. One of the interesting questions I always have is like, why do we do that hypothesizing post hoc, right? Drexler was writing when nanotechnologies were already being developed. We're having these conversations about baby Xenobots after they've already procreated. And like, we're sort of always, it seems like ethicists tend to be one step behind the curve. Science fiction authors can't know enough about what's happening on the ground to hypothesize actual scenarios, and ethicists aren't involved directly in the technology enough to slow it down before it happens. So we end up in this backwards looking reactive sort of stance. And I know, Dr. Kubler, you and I have talked about this, whether ethics is reactive or proactive. Yeah, the gray goose story is really fascinating. And I love the idea that you let out one little nanobot and it, eats my desk, and then my desk turns to nanobots, and then my phone, and then like my cat, right? And off and running. And we've got goo.
Well, I like the idea that I could, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you look up gray goo on Wikipedia, you'll find that Prince Charles of the British Royal Society wanted to investigate the possible environmental and social risks of that. And that was as recent as 2004. And then later on, a more recent analysis was titled Safe Exponential Manufacturing from the Institute of Physics by the Director of Research at the Center for Responsible Nanotechnology. Eric Drexler was involved in that. And then Safe Exponential Manufacturing was published in 2004, the issue of nanotechnology, so on and so there's, it stimulated a lot of interest, and I'm sure it's very much related to what we'll be talking about today. So, yes. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you, Dr. Kubler.
Oh, no, I was just thinking about the possibilities and, the possible good outcome, that there could be something out there that I could feed my kids that would give them the memory and proper training to take out the trash and do other chores. Wouldn't that be a step forward?
Yeah, it's advertised on TV. Haven't you seen the advertisements? So,
yeah. Are there examples, really, Jonathan, maybe where ethicists are ahead of the curve? I mean, you made the point. It seems a bit self-deprecating to the profession there that they're behind the curve, but I don't know. I've seen such profound things coming from you and other ethicists. I would actually think they are ahead of the curve in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess that's right. I guess I was being a little both self and peer deprecating in my comment there, but yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There have been, I guess my story is thinking about the way that technologies develop, and it's been only very few and very recent, especially biotechnologies, in which federal funding has gone hand in hand, right, on the scientific side and the LC, ethical, legal, and social implication side. So the Human Genome Project is one great example of that, where there was a percentage of federal funding. If I remember, it was on the order of like 10% of funds had to be dedicated to LC concerns alongside the technical research. So around particular technologies, we think, oh gosh, there's something very relevant about human genetic information. And so we recognize there's ethical implications, and we're going to fund that research alongside the technical. So I think it's maybe just a sense of being overwhelmed, right? There's so much more money going into the technological development side as opposed to the sort of ethics side. And ethicists, I mean, we do our work, those of us working in ethics and technology anyway, do our work sort of on our own. And so we rely on scientific publications, which are already, they're written and published on results of experiments that have already happened. So staying involved requires interdisciplinary work, which is, again, where we've positioned ourselves at UCF, Steve, in terms of the Center for Ethics, trying to work with our colleagues to see what's happening. And
I think,
go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, one of the biggest problems has to do with our politicians, who seem to have never taken a class in science at all. I mean, it's just amazing, the ignorance. So yeah, somehow, they need to have scientists and philosophers and ethicists on their board before they make decisions about this kind of thing.
Yeah, it is interesting that a lot of the regulations and policy are driven by politicians. And you're right, Stephen, many of whom don't have the expertise that we'd like them to have, or even the capacity to listen to experts that we'd like them to have. Like, I don't feel any need to be on a legislative decision-making board necessarily, as long as I've got folks on those boards who are listening. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and the reason I think we were so interested in Levin's work, and then also to follow up now this afternoon, is that he's tried to position his work and the collaborative institutions he's working with, so Vermont and Tufts, and there's one other that are collaborating on Xenobots. He's tried to position it as very constrained and very listening to ethics experts. In fact, at one point in an article about these Xenobots, he says that we don't have to be too worried about ethical concerns because the Xenobots are entirely contained in a lab. They're easily extinguished, which is an interesting turn of phrase. They're biodegradable, and they're regulated by ethics experts. And they don't pollute, right? Because there's no steel or plastics involved. These are entirely biological organisms. So he's trying to position this cutting edge scientific work with all sorts of potential ethical implications as thoughtfully positioned, right? It's not like they're willy-nilly making robots and dumping them in the river to see what happens. They're trying to work under ethical guidance in very constrained situations. And yet my instinct is that there's something instinctively kind of icky about what's going on with Xenobots. And the ickiness is, I think, one of the things I'd like to talk about. I'll put in the chat here the article from November of 2021, where that was the report on the self-replication. So I guess I'll tell you a little bit story, unless anybody else wants to share the story about Xenobots and their replication. When we talked with Levin in Ethically Speaking, or when he shared his research with us, he mentioned that the term Xenobot comes from the name of the frog, the African clawed frog, Xenopus levis, that he used to build the Xenobots. And again, building the Xenobots is kind of a misnomer because they just extracted cells from these frogs, didn't genetically alter them in any way, just mechanical isolation, and found out that they work together in groups and self-heal and had all these interesting properties, including movement. So they're not genetically modified in any way, but he's made the claim, and his lab has made the claim, that this is an entirely new life form, that it's not, it's a collection of cells that performs like an organism. It can self-heal, as I mentioned. It can feed off its own energy reserves for a week or so, 10 days. And if you provide it with nutrients, they'll last months, just doing their little things. And he in his talk for us in the podcast that we had you listen to, he made this really interesting connection, Sterling, to William James. He said that just like on William James' definition of intelligence, Xenobots are intelligent. William James, the American pragmatist who Sterling has studied and continues to lean on, made the claim that intelligence is pragmatic, right? To view intelligence as something useful. So the idea of intelligence is that a thing can get to a goal, the same goal, in many different ways, despite perturbations. So despite things getting in the way, the thing can still accomplish its goal. And that sort of goal-oriented teleological view of intelligence comes right from James and fits the bill for the Xenobots, because they can do that, right? They can move and avoid obstacles and get to nutrient gradients, and they perform as intelligent. Now, I don't know, Sterling, if you want to weigh in there, but from what I understand, not everybody shares William James's sense of intelligence.
Yeah, well, I can't say that I got into that version, that specific focus of William James. Mine was more on belief and making things work. So yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say about how he comes around being with people's intelligence. But yeah, I suppose pragmatically, you don't have to be very intelligent at all if you're getting from A to B, and you know, you're being, you could be cunning or you know, but not necessarily intelligent. I don't know how to feel about that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, in some sense, I think Levin is being philosophically acerbic a little bit. He's sort of like poking the bear, as my colleague would say, my Romanian colleague would say. He's using intelligence to as a label for his Xenobots in order to get us to think about what they are and really tell a story. In some sense, they're complex organizations of cells and they can do some interesting things, but to call them intelligent sort of broadens the least common denominator of that phrase to include a lot of things, including maybe like complex artificial systems, AI systems or the like. And he talks a little bit about that in his podcast.
to some extent, he's reviving discussions that have already happened about what constitutes complexity and complex behavior, that, you know, primitive organisms, but a lot of them may be working because of one another, in concert with one another, display structured actions that seems to imply some sort of higher goal or higher intellectuality that's beyond that of just the individual, as wasps behave, bees behave, ants, termites, other social insects, and so on. So it's kind of extrapolating it down, you know, to a lower common denominator. But I think it's a bit of a trope we've heard before.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What is the end game? You know,
for whom?
Having fun? Yeah, no, for you, no. For as far as the Xenobots go, I mean, what does he plan for them to do? Or, you know, it's not like we were talking about the AI, but is he just having fun with?
Well, he talks about a number of different research directions and goals. Some of them maybe potentially application driven in medical science, others more intellectually driven. You know, one goal on the medical side is that maybe you could now make little bio machines that could clean out your arteries. I could probably use them. My wife's always telling me I use too much butter, right? So, you know, maybe you could make something that's biologically compatible and programmable to go in there and right wrongs in, you know, in the human body, or, you know, to augment function. He makes the point that, and this is a very complex argument he makes, so it's really worth looking at the podcast, but he makes the argument that we can augment systems by non-biological means with electronics and computers, that we use computers, and that in some ways augments our own mental capacity. And so there could be a merger of the two. You could think about embedding chips in your brain, right? There's a couple of billionaires out there who are already working on that sort of thing. And I'm not sure if I want the chip, although at times it would be great to have a little extra memory, right? But then we can imagine implanting things that are hybrids across that spectrum of mechanical, electronic to biological. And that brings it more to the intellectual discussion of what then does life mean? You know, is life organic? Is mechanical and electronic inherently non-life, or is it life because it displays intellect, maybe as defined, you know, by philosophers or biologists? And what about those that are in between on that spectrum, that are maybe augmented organisms that have mechanical, electronic, and organic function? And, you know, where is the species going, and how do we think about our phylogenetic tree and the differentiation of life and our classifications of life? So he sees some potentially promising applications, and he makes very strong and emotion-driven arguments about how much still death and suffering there is in the world, you know, that you can have genetic deformities and maladies and conditions that maybe these kinds of Xenobots could fix. So it's a very altruistic vision of the potential applications, not entirely eschewing, but successfully managing to sweep under the carpet some of the potential Frankensteinian outcomes. And, you know, to Dr. Beaver's point, arguing pretty effectively that all of this is done with great control and structure. And even, you know, comment was made that he's consulting with a rabbi and others to think about, you know, theological and philosophical implications. And that's all laudable. You know, that's noble. It's great to think of scientists and engineers increasingly engaging in the discussion, maybe even driving the discussion of the moral and ethical implications of their work. That said, you know, it is sold pretty effectively as a potential panacea, right? You know, a technology that's going to right all wrongs. And I'm not sure I know of any technology that really does that.
Well, obviously, one of the problems is trying to figure out what are the emergent properties that we don't know about now. So, for example, what if Xenobots all of a sudden somehow seem to have emotion, feelings? I know for a long time it was argued that simple things such as fish do not feel pain. I mean, you catch them, you eat them, you know, and this is the whole animal rights issue. And later on, studies indicated, well, yes, fish do feel pain. Maybe they don't have emotions the way intellectual animals do, and yet they do. So where does ethics come in to dealing with that? Obviously, that's a big problem with people like probably most of us that eat meat and catch fish. So when do these things cross the line between something that has to be more carefully protected? So I don't know, that's in the far distant future, I'm sure, but nonetheless, maybe not that far.
I think that's a directly relevant concern. I mean, one of the things Levin says, and even in his ethically speaking lecture, is that projects like this sort of push against, I think he calls them convenient boundaries or binaries, right? And it's interesting to think that a lot of ethics has always stood on those binaries, that we had responsibilities to humans in a way that we didn't have to non-human animals. And there was this really clear divide between, Descartes would say things with minds and things with no minds, or things with souls, as Aquinas would say, or things with no souls, or whatever. And I think you're right, Stephen, that like those boundaries have been blurred. One of the studies about fish that I remember was done by a researcher at Penn State, who injected a little bit of bee venom into the lips of fish and rubbed them out to the bottom of the tank because they experienced the equivalent of pain, right? And these terms like pain, which we've applied in a somewhat loose way, we've got lots of now neurological and sensory data that they extend way down into the phylogenetic spectrum. And some of the work that I've been reading and thinking about lately is about tree communication, right? There's really interesting research now about the ways individual members of tree stands will chemically communicate with others about predation or about disease or about drought, and communicate that through root systems and causing other trees to respond. And we call that, the research has called that communication, in the same way that Levin has sort of toyed with the idea of intelligence, that we're pushing the boundaries against these black and white. He lists a bunch of these in his podcast that I jotted down, like human animal, living machine, natural synthetic, questions of cognitive agency, or what's an organism, or what's a robot. And it's interesting that when we start to blur those lines, we blur the lines on the ethics side too. That we can't just take for granted that just because a lot of us eat lobster, we don't have to worry about lobsters anymore. Lobster is my go-to because I grew up in Maine, and I remember we used to just like dump lobsters on a hot thing and watch them turn red. And then there was this moment when we started to stand them on their heads, because apparently there was this thinking that they went to sleep or something, and it's kind of shifted over time. I've tried that with my kids, Steve, too. It just doesn't work the same. You can't just stand them on their heads.
Well, I thought you dropped them in hot water.
No, to clarify, I'm not boiling my kids. Just terrible analogy. Thank you for that, Sterling.
No children were harmed in the production of this ethics discussion.
Just another example, by the way, is Dolly the sheep cloning, which was not supposed to happen. I invested in Jaron way back right when that happened. I thought, wow, this is going to be big. That was more than 20 years ago. And Jaron has not done much. They sold off all their patents except for one, which has to do with cancer research, but they're cloning. But that was a total accident. They did not expect Dolly to actually be produced by that early experiment. And of course, now it has become a business. People are cloning their pets, at first cats and then now dogs. It's $40,000, I think, to clone your pet. But nonetheless, some people can afford it and they do it. And prize-winning bulls. I think there's some horses that are, some kind of competition that are cloned. That was on CBS 60 Minutes a while back. But yeah, that was unexpected. Biologists did not predict that. So,
and that's another great example of like boundary blurring. Like there were early concerns around Dolly that what would happen if you had two of the identical organism, and it's just not the case that sort of that led to a pushback against so-called genetic determinism, that everything about us was defined by our genes. Dolly and Dolly's offspring, had it survived, would have been two different organisms, maybe the same genetically, but different experiences, different inputs, they would have been different. And the same thing goes all the way down, maybe except for Xenobots. This is where like the hypotheticals start to creep in. The idea, a month after Levin gave his talk here, his colleagues in Vermont, University of Vermont, reported the self-replication phenomenon. And the story is kind of cool. They used, I don't know if you read about it or not, but they used an AI algorithm to optimize design. So basically body shape of these organisms.
Yeah,
with
sure.
Pac-Man shapes. And the Pac-Man shapes would go around and eat stem cells in the gradient, in the nutrient gradient. And those stem cells would bind together and create another Xenobot. And so under particular circumstances, you can make more and more of them. And I don't know, I mean, I think that's really interesting, but yeah, I don't know if it pushes against binaries in the way that Levin thinks. And it made me think, like, is there anything particular about that technology? If the cells had been pulled out of the frog and then genetically manipulated and then had procreated, would that make us feel better or worse? I mean, there's all kinds of, what exactly is ethically touchy about baby Xenobots, if anything?
Yeah, they actually mapped out the original cell. They knew, exactly what parts or which organs developed from each part of it. And they mechanistically separated those and selected the ones that they wanted and reassembled them. This was all done mechanically, with tweezers and stuff like that. It was just incredible. By the way, I'm going to post in the chat something that I just came across you might be interested in. It's called How We Accidentally Started Making Infinite Robots. And this just came out March 19th, just 2 weeks ago. And it's about a 20-minute video. It's on a 6-part series of Curiosity Stream. It was even better than the original one, I think, that was posted by the original one that you posted. So let me put it up there, so you can maybe watch it later on. It was too late to post it before this meeting, but
I'll make sure I'll share that in our YouTube channel too, so folks can see it.
Okay, so here it is. Okay, there you go. So YouTube, and it's only 19 minutes. Wonderful. Really well done. So definitely gonna watch that.
One of the things so I remember having conversations back when genetically modified things were a fad and an ethical concern, and people were still talking about them a lot. And one of the arguments, the go-to arguments, had been basically an argument from purity, that there was something unnatural about genetically manipulating something to create a new organism. And now this isn't genetic manipulation, but I wonder if that sort of purity argument still holds, that what Levin and his colleagues are doing is unnatural, and that's why it's unethical.
What is natural anymore? I mean, if we're here, everything is natural. I think both the religious types and maybe the extremely scientific, very narrow types, there's this division. My phone going again. Let me just get rid of this.
I agree with you, Stephen. Like, I feel pretty confident setting that argument aside. I mean, I know it's important to a lot of people and a particular demographic of people for sure, but I'm trying to map out like where the ethical concerns lie around Xenobots. Because I mean, one option is there are none, but Levin thinks there are. And I would wager, I mean, Dr. Kubler, you mentioned he's talking to a rabbi. So there are religious and cultural and theological concerns that go along with that work. But the other bucket of concern is like I guess we call them the safety concerns, right? Like, to what end are these going to be used? What's their purpose? We talked a little bit about that just a couple of minutes ago, but I heard or read this morning that part of Levin's work has been funded by DARPA, the defense agency contractor. So it's interesting to think, like, why would DARPA be interested in this research? For what end? It might be, I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic here either, because it might be, as you said, Dr. Kibler, maybe DARPA is interested in healing properties or medical side. Like, the idea that Xenobots could be weaponized seems a little far-fetched to me, but I think it's on the table of concerns and trying to map those out. And finding a structured way to do that is really interesting. So safety concerns in one bucket, no concerns in the other bucket over here, a religious and cultural bucket of concerns. And are there others that we can identify?
I don't know if you've been back to Dr. Levin's site recently there at Tufts, but if you go into his research, the title is morphogenic systems as cognitive agents. Now, what the heck does that mean? And he's got a nice little graph laying out there, 3 lines of research. The first one is synthetic biology. The second one is development of bioinformatics of shape. And the final one is using techniques from artificial intelligence, computational neuroscience, and cognitive science to make models of morphogenesis, treating patterning systems as primitive cognitive agents. So I can't say that I understood it. I just read through it. It looks very interesting. I'd like to understand it better. But yeah, cognitive agents, we're getting into intelligence. I know some people that will not, they'll eat animals that they consider that are not intelligent. Like they will not eat pigs, they will not eat but they'll eat, fish they don't consider intelligent. So that's their dividing line. So what happens when we develop these systems that actually display great intelligence? Where's the red line for that? And that's what they're working on, but they're doing it, of course, from the other side by this, that's their research. So yeah. I mean, transplanting an eye on the tail of a tadpole, I mean, that got me. I thought, what? Okay, we are making Frankenstein creatures. So how far do we go with that?
Yeah, so that's another bucket that I think had been on my mind, Stephen, is the welfare bucket, right? So there are a lot of, when Levin talked with us, and from what we've read of his research, he got to Xenobots through animal testing. So there's like research subjects welfare concerns, but then there's Xenobot welfare concern too, because we've all seen enough science fiction movies where there's the like supercomputer who's actually an organism, but it's like hooked up and immobile and like just used as an instrument to whatever, right?
Yeah.
All kinds of movies like this. And it does seem like one potential of this research, granted it's very early, is supercomputing, right? Biological supercomputing. And the question is, once a thing can supercompute, do we owe any ethical responsibility to it? Do we have a duty to a thing because it's intelligent? And what does intelligence mean? And again, when Levin is saying he wants to blur these boundaries, it makes me a little uncomfortable, because if we get to a point where we have to worry about a supercomputer that is biological, then we have responsibilities and duties towards it directly, not to mention all the things that led up to it, right? All the things we've killed in a lab and all the tadpoles with eyes on their tails who might be suffering in particular ways and all of those things. So there's the welfare bucket, I think, is a really important one too. And again, that bucket has sort of two, the bottom part and the top part, research subjects and the thing itself. And that's where I'm really interested. I want to know, like, as these things develop, is the idea that they're going to start working together to process or store information and or energy, and then to what end and how are we going to use them and all those things. The terminology I mentioned early on, right? The terminology from news reports and things is not that they're easily terminated or euthanized or whatever. The language is something like easily extinguished, right? So right now we don't think about Xenobots in the way we think about rats in a lab, which are euthanized humanely, but rather we just extinguish them like we would a candle. And
I wonder if he uses the term extinguish because he's hedging on the notion of whether they are truly alive or not, or to avoid, I don't know why he would do that, because he asserts that they're a new life form, right?
This came from, so that phrase easily extinguished came from a news report about the procreation.
So perhaps it's the journalists' effort to try to remain neutral there on whether they're actually life.
Right. I would be interested to know what Levin would
no longer determine the dividing line between life and artificial life. So yeah, that shocked me when I heard him say that, and that's because of the research he's doing. By the way, one more thing. I don't know if you've seen the movie Millennium Man with Robin Williams. This is where Robin Williams, he's a human developed robot, but as he's developed in time, he develops more and more human abilities to express emotion until finally that's the last module. And then he starts demanding, of course, the same rights that other humans have. Anyway, it was well done. This is not a new movie either. So it's right down your line there, Dr. Beaver. You might want to check that out.
Yeah, that
Is
sounds
that
really
what-
interesting. Yeah, I think we learn so much from the
Yeah.
ways we hypothesize in science fiction. Yeah.
Indeed.
I have a kind of a complicated question. It might be more for Dr. Beaver to help us navigate, but I'd be interested in what other people think as well. When we have these kinds of conversations, I find myself doing the same thing that I think others do, where you try to provide examples from past history that provide some context or ability to analyze or maybe accept or reject the notion. So for example, the idea that putting the eye on the tadpole is Frankensteinian, I have that impulse as well. But I also found myself thinking, well, you know, I think one of the things that enabled beef to become plentifully available was modification of longhorn cattle, so that they didn't have these big pokey horns and you could pack them into trains and trucks or whatever and ship them around. So what is less Frankensteinian about what we did there? Or, you know, you could talk about genetic manipulation of crops and such. And so it made me kind of step back from that effort to try to come up with a counterexample and make me question, why do we do that? Why do we do that, Dr. Beaver? I guess some people could be doing that in order to excuse the technology, or say, look, this is permissible because you've already accepted this. Or do you find it productive insofar as it causes people to kind of look more broadly at what we do and what we have done as a society or species? It doesn't enable us to stop and look back over our shoulder and maybe become more ethical by questioning things that we've accepted in the past? Or does it not even clash in some way with the argument? Does it distract us away from the ethical focus of the issue? Do you understand my question?
I think so. Yeah, no, I think I do. Do other folks have I've got thoughts. Yeah. But
well, how about xenotransplantation? Actually, we just had this fellow that had a heart transplant with a pig, actually, even though he only lived for 2 more months. And I read that they also have done experiments where they have somehow caused a certain organ to be grown on another part of the body until it's fully matured, and then removed it and put it on the correct part of the body. I mean, yeah, I think that's fine. I mean, I'm all in favor of doing that. But we do need to consider the ethics of it, obviously, but it seems to me it's going forward.
Yeah, I agree. You got me thinking, the question got me thinking about, what arguments have been offered about, say, animal welfare that have guided those sorts of decisions, whether it's pig xenotransplantation or whether it's growing organs on a mouse and then transplanting them to another organism, or whether it's breeding longhorn cattle to not have horns. One of the arguments that I sort of grew up intellectually thinking about was the argument from teleology. So animal ethicist Bernard Rollins, who just passed away, food ethicist Paul Thompson up at Michigan State, they both made this argument that we should be guided by what a thing's natural capacities are. So for instance, Paul Thompson wrote this article or defined this problem, the blind chicken problem, which has been around a while now. And the idea is, if chickens in confinement are, one of the ethical issues is that they peck each other under conditions of stress. And one way to alleviate that is to blindfold birds, which is what we do with, raptors in captivity and the like. Then you could just genetically manipulate chickens to be blind and then pack them into confinement and they wouldn't peck each other to death.
Yeah.
The argument for that, of course, is great. We're solving this problem, but we're not getting at the root of the sort of big factory farming production system. And we're manipulating a chicken's telos, like its chickenness, Rollins would say. Like the claim, this is an old like Aristotelian claim, still sticking around, that each particular species, what makes it a thing is that it's got a certain set of capacities that define it. So chicken has dust bathing and pecking and social hierarchies and all of the things that make it a chicken. And once you start taking those away, you're changing its nature. And so growing an ear on my leg to then transplant to my ear, Stephen, seems like a different case. I'm not really changing my nature. And there's somewhere in between, Dr. Kilber, about like breeding longhorn cattle to not poke each other with the long horns. That's maybe changing the cow's nature, but maybe not. And then there was this proposal just this week, and I'll put this in the chat too, for what the news reported as matrix style vertical chicken farms, where chickens would be grown sort of hooked up to removing their cerebral cortex and hooking them up to machinery to keep them bred, so that they would just be basically meat bags stacked together, right? So that they wouldn't have any experience, so to speak of, and so they wouldn't be suffering. And that just seems horrifying, but also like it's only one step removed from lab-grown meat, which is growing an organism from cells to not have a cerebral cortex in the first place. And all of these instances are blurring that boundary. You can't really get off the ground with a telos argument if we've destroyed the idea that chickenness is really a thing in the first place. The same way with like living versus non-living. So we might think Xenobots are no big deal because they're a new organism. They don't really have a telos. We're defining what it is. And so we could just define it such that they are not suffering and move ahead.
Well, I think
I'm
the
on
issue,
my way to becoming a vegetarian. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was going to say the issue expands into the entire eco-biological system. I mean, how far do you go with that? We already, of course, well, let me back up. 98% of all species that ever lived have gone extinct. You know, so at what point do we disturb this balance of nature that we have to where, you know, we upset it even more than we already have? On the other hand, it's maybe through this type of experimentation that might be the only narrow path we have to survival. It is a balance. Why did those other species go extinct? Well, because they couldn't do what we do. Of course, what we do may lead us to go extinct. I mean, so it's a tough one. So we kind of nibble around the edges where we use animals for our own benefit. But now, for example, when we raise cattle to eat, of course, that affects the entire ecosystem drastically, as a matter of fact. And we're being urged to eat less meat because it is so energy inefficient. So I think you have to broaden this whole discussion into how it fits into the entire ecosystem, the whole biological system.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
That's all. Somebody else.
It looked like you were going to.
Steve. We had two Steves here. Sorry.
If you have a follow-on comment, go ahead and make it, Dr. Beaver. I was going to take us back to your comment about chickenness and the philosophers whose names I can't remember in their arguments.
I was just gonna say, like, it feels, I have this lingering worry in the back of my head that everything is always a trade-off, and so there's no way to avoid unethical implications. It's merely about balancing them with potential benefits, and because we can never see the potential benefits, we're left in this world in which we just rely on unethical implications, whether that's animal suffering or misuses of technologies or anything, in the hopes that it's going to lead to a better future. And that's always bothered me, but that's a tangent. So Dr. Kubler, go ahead. The philosophers were Paul Thompson at Michigan State and Bernard Rollin, who was at Colorado State. Okay,
so thinking more about Thompson and Rollin's arguments, one of the things that I struggle with is I really want to be part of the conversation that tries to leverage ethical frameworks to make better outcomes, right? And pass judgments and decide what we're going to do with Xenobots and other things. But like so many disciplines, there's a healthy discussion, but also maybe a stagnation, because I guess some utilitarians, help me if I'm getting this wrong, but would say, well, what are the net benefits and the harms? Is this worth doing, right? And then other ethicists like Rollins and Thompson would kind of lean in more to an argument about chickenness, or an argument about not sanctity, I guess it is really. It's a principle of sanctity, right? That you somehow take away the organism's sanctity by making it less chickeny or whatever. And I don't know how valuable that argument is. I wonder first of all, how would they assess cultures. I mean, I shave, so am I less human because I'm taking away the natural hair? There's some cultures that use neck extending rings, right, and actually pull the collarbones out because it's considered a form of beauty. And that's a cultural difference, a cultural distinction. Would those ethicists point at that and say they're dehumanizing? Maybe I'm engaging in a little reducto absurdum by pushing that, but it seems to me there's a spectrum. And if we can move very comfortably or uncomfortably up and down that spectrum, it tells me we're not going anywhere. And so I can't lean in with confidence on the sanctity arguments, nor can I lean in with confidence on the utilitarian arguments to go anywhere with this important question.
Yeah, that's well said. I think there is a spectrum that shows up in arguments. And I think, to channel my inner Rollins and Thompson, I think their response would be, shaving doesn't change your capacity to grow hair, and we evaluate a thing's telos based on its capacities. So if we genetically blind a chicken, if we blindfold a chicken physically, we can remove the blindfold. Its capacity hasn't changed. We can still calm down birds by putting blindfolds over them. But if we genetically alter chickens such that they can't see, we've changed their capacities. So I think theirs is a capacities-based account. That doesn't say there aren't
other. That was
other.
helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the difference between that and then breeding for the same thing? In other words, we enter into a symbiotic relationship with these animals. In some cases, they have mutated so far that they probably wouldn't exist without our support, as a matter of fact. So yeah, and some of these animals probably couldn't survive in nature. Left on their own. They only survive because they're close to us and that we need them and they need us.
Yeah, I remember. I can picture the call and response of that argument from the genetic manipulation ethics conversations. The argument, I think you're right on, Stephen, is that like we've done this by breeding for generations. Like, what's the difference doing it at the level of the genome? And the response to that is, well, there's really no difference in the end, but it's about how well the organism can then resituate into its ecology, right? So if we do it by breeding, it has a chance to situate and it shifts its ecosystem. If we do it genetically, it happens instantaneously with no other changes, and that could be disruptive. It's not a very strong argument, but I think that's the go-to rebuttal. Sterling, I saw your hand.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to pull a lot of what everybody's saying, and I'm thinking, like Dr. Kubler said, we're like spinning our wheels. He doesn't know whether to commit one way or the other and then you were talking about chickenness, and I was thinking about the bioethics of abortion and the people that are they have strong arguments that avoid personhood, some of which just look at potentiality and are against abortion because of potentiality. And even today, when I mean, at this current time, I've been looking at, and I think I told you 2 weeks ago, rationing of healthcare, and potentiality seems to be a big argument. And although ageism tries to defend the elderly, potentiality seems to be this one of the strongest tiebreakers, let's say, for allocation of healthcare, whether it be ventilators or not really the vaccines on the front end. The vaccination process really seems to be a utilitarian, public health addresses utilitarian approaches more than the individual bioethic consideration. But between Dr. Kubler saying he's spinning his wheel, we don't seem to be able to get very far just with the abortion issue. Not that I'm saying Xenobots are people or ever will be, or chickenness, but I mean, personhood is very similar to chickenness or whatever else y'all were saying. Chicken. And the other thing I wanted to weigh in on, and it's been about 5 years, and I was on the highway, and I really wanted to pull over and write down who it was, but you're talking about the eye on the end of a tail of something, I don't know. Well, the lecture was that, and Dr. Kubler certainly will know better than I do at this point, was we really don't, still today, where 5 years ago, we do not understand the process of vision and the synapses and how that chemically something happens up there to become an image. but they were saying that the tongue is so highly sensitive and, you know, having nerve endings, that they were working on putting tiny photo cells or some sort of photo thing on the tips of people's tongues, so that blind people would actually eventually possibly be able to gain sight by just sticking their tongue out and waving their tongue around, which would, you know, that'd make them kind of like a snake or something. But the process was that whatever this chemical and this signal ability that goes on in the brain that's not really well understood, that if they could figure out where it will adapt to that, putting a photocell on the tongue, and it will say, hey, that's a photocell, or, you know, that's an eye, and there it is. Let's create a pathway for it to become an image. It was really fascinating. Anyway, I don't know if any of y'all have heard anything about that, but I was like, wow. But, you know, you'd have blind people walking around with I mean, they could do it.
Yeah, that's so interesting, blurring those boundaries. Yeah, Stephen, go ahead.
Well, the shocking thing about the eye on the tail of the tadpole was not only that the eye survived, but that it was a functional eye that was tied into the nervous system. And then in the little program that I submitted there in the chat, find that, of course, these Xenobots are also self-repairing. So when they're damaged, they can repair themselves. And this seems to be a natural function. It was not predicted that they would do that, but apparently they do. And so then how far, again, it's back to the gray goo thing. What would happen if somehow they mutate and are able to evolve, and how far could they evolve? And, you know, how does it could it possibly get out of control, et cetera? You're muted. There you go. I'm going to mute.
Shanor, I know you're listening in. If you want to jump in, feel free. No pressure, but I just wanted to recognize you're here too with us.
So I guess this is fairly new topic for me. This is the first time hearing about it, so I'm just absorbing it and processing it, and I'm a little scared.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just wow.
I know. I have the same reaction, Shanor. Like, it's on the one hand so cool, and on the other hand, there's so much unknown, right? And I think that circles back around to something Sterling said. You know, when we're evaluating potential in healthcare, for instance, it's complicated to do that even with, especially in healthcare rationing, with young people versus older people in the healthcare system. We evaluate their potential, and that's one way in which we ration care. If you add another variable, like the ontology variable, and that's the abortion debate, where does life start? Where does human life start? If we add in that variable, then we have to consider the full range of embryonic cell all the way up to older human individual. Healthcare rationing becomes that much more complicated. And then, Shanor, to your point, if we add in a third variable, an epistemic variable, we just don't know very much about Xenobots yet. So we've got these ontological questions, we've got these unknowns, and we've got these ethical concerns. And that makes me think, right? That it feels really, that's a lot of variables. It's a lot of messy terrain to drive through. I'm trying to extend an analogy here. I can't do it. But
and
that's what makes it so interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so the other thing, you know, we were identifying different issues, and I thought one is equity issue as well. So, you know, when these do become available, and people want to enhance their ability or whatever, then you also have the equity and access issue.
Yeah, yes, well said. And that's true of, I think, every technology, especially medical technologies. To whom are they available, in what order, at what cost? Yep, and those are access and equity issues. Yep.
And then one more thing is the GMO aspect of this whole thing. You know, we're already modifying a lot of our food right now, and there are, you know, health implications from that. And so, you know, this idea about the chicken not having cerebral cortex is a little scary to me, because is it then even a chicken? You know?
Yeah, there's go ahead, Shino. Sorry, I got excited.
And what does that mean? Like, when I eat it, how am I going to digest it? I mean, so yes, I'm going vegetarian with Dr. Kugler.
You're joining the club then, Shanor. Yeah, there's sort of two things going on what you said, Shanor. One is the like safety, consumable safety side. And I just want to point out that there's no scientific evidence that GMOs are detrimental to our health, but there are health implications, because monocropping GMOs tends to take more industrial pesticide and herbicide use, and that leads to increased pressures on waterways, so indirect concerns on health. So you're right. So there's that going on, but then there's the like, is it weird and icky to grow chickens with no cerebral cortexes, right? And there's that thing going on too, and I think that's really important. It's a welfare question. It's a sanctity issue about the species, maybe. It's a telos question. That landscape is odd. So this proposal by an architect to stack 1,000 chickens with no cerebral cortexes high in a warehouse and tube feed them until they're big enough to harvest is indoor farming, greenhouse farming with chickens, or something like chickens. And that is I mean, again, that's why it's in Wired magazine, right? It's not like this is happening right now, but it's the same kind of potential with Xenobots. It's this like potential horror that's a combination of the ickiness and potential pragmatic implications.
Well,
I know. Go ahead, Sterling. Yeah.
I'm just the whole thing that the vertical chicken thing. I know that mussels make the meat tougher, but that doesn't even sound good. You know, I mean, there's just absolutely no. It just sounds like it'd be spam. Chicken spam grown on a vertical.
I don't know. I mean, we for
sounds terrible.
For brood, so for meat chickens now, it's not like most of the chicken we consume in the world, a huge percentage of it, is grown functionally under similar conditions, only horizontal.
I guess, but
they don't. It's not like they have a space to run around and develop muscle mass. They're bred to be huge, can't really even stand up given the size of their breasts, and then they're slaughtered. So
I don't know.
It all tastes like chicken. Maybe that's the concluding remark. Dr. Kuja, I know you have to go, so we'll end at 1 o'clock. Thank you all for such a great conversation. Let's do this again, because I think we're going to learn more about Xenobots.
Yep.
I want to post.
Oh, go ahead.
I want to post one more quick thing on it, since you're talking so much about chickens. Have you heard of Mike the Headless Chicken?
I have not.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want you to check this out. This is a farmer, actually, who, they always cut off the head of the chicken, and the chickens usually drop dead pretty quickly. But this one chicken was still running around the next day after his head was cut off. And this is true story, absolutely true. In fact, the farmer actually took this chicken on the road, made lots of money. For months, this chicken lived. Obviously, it had, well, in fact, I can show you a picture. If you use the website that I just put up there, you will see the picture of Mike the Headless Chicken, and you will see that the whole story. It's an incredible story. It's incredible, but it actually is real. So check that out anyways.
We will check that out.
And we need to do this again. I fear that we didn't get so many people because they didn't get the notice. In fact, we probably should ask Sterling Courtney there how he arrived here, whether or not, because if he used the same URL from the last, 2 Wednesdays ago. But yeah, you need to be sure to send that out, and we'll have, this was such a good discussion. I hope that we can do it again with more people for sure.
Yeah, let's do it again. And I'll promise to send out the weekend before the link to everybody. And you should feel free, everybody, to reach out to friends and colleagues of yours that might be interested. Again, this organization, this discussion group is open to anybody who wants to join in. So
is it the same link used each time?
Same link every time. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, because the link is also not on your website. Maybe that's intended, but the link for this is not to get to this. Is not on your website. I looked.
Part of that is intentional because we wanted to avoid Zoom bombing, but I think for access, we've got to get it up. So we'll add it. Yep.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.